Okay, I want to say that I'm very happy and very honored to be invited here to be a speaker. I didn't have the kinds of direct interpersonal relations with Jerry that I think most of the speakers did have. On the other hand, I can say that his work influenced me very much, but of course that's true of practically anybody who's worked in philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science. So more specifically, there's a theme in his work that I'm very sympathetic with, and that has influenced me very heavily, which I think others are by and large not very sympathetic with, and that's going to figure quite centrally in what I have to say here. A two-part theme. On the one hand, he wanted to claim that much of cognition, including things like belief fixation, meaning the formation and maintenance of beliefs, and things like action planning, consists of cognition that is highly holistic and highly non-modular. That's one aspect of it. A second aspect related closely for him, and plausibly I think, was that this kind of cognition cannot plausibly be understood as computation. The problem isn't with mental representations, it's with the idea that this kind of cognition can be understood as the computational manipulation of mental representations. The thought there was that if you're going to have tractable computation, you need an encapsulated database, and that means you've got to be dealing with a module. I'm very sympathetic with these ideas. Now, for him, there was a third apparent corollary, which was we really don't have the faintest idea how this kind of cognition operates. And if you recall the end of his short book, The Mind Doesn't Work That Way, where he was trashing massive modularity, he pretty much said that. What we mostly learned is that, by and large, what we learned about the mind is that we don't know how it works. That I'm not so sympathetic with. I think we do have at least a clue, and some of that will come out in what I have to say. So this is a paper co-authored with my colleagues David Henderson at the University of Nebraska and Matjaž Potrč at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. Morphological content and chromatic illumination and belief fixation. Belief fixation is the formation and maintenance of beliefs. Humans, despite their epistemic foibles, often engage in rational belief fixation, thereby forming and maintaining doxastically justified beliefs. We're going to argue for the following claims. First, rational belief fixation typically is inferential, in a way that draws holistically and abductively upon rich amounts of pertinent evidence possessed by the belief-forming cognizer. Second, much of this evidence is and must be accommodated during belief fixation without getting represented during the process. Nevertheless, third, the doxastic justification of a given belief depends heavily and constitutively upon conscious appreciation of the evidential support that accrues into this belief, even though typically much of this evidential support never becomes overtly present in consciousness during belief fixation. All right, so we have a section called Rationality and the Frame Problem. The frame problem in cognitive science, which first arose in the early days of AI work, reveals aspects of human rationality that often have been overlooked, both in philosophy and psychology. The frame problem pertains both to theoretical rationality concerning matters like belief fixation and to practical rationality concerning matters like action and planning, while also, I think, revealing how deeply intertwined these two kinds of cognition actually are. These underappreciated aspects of rationality were nicely brought into view by a paper by Daniel Dennett in 1984. And we actually, in the paper, we quote Dennett at some length. I'm going to just do a bit of sampling here to give you the feel for it. He starts his essay on the frame problem with the following parable. I think many of you will have read this paper and will remember this. Once upon a time, there was a robot named R1 by its creators. Its only task was to fend for itself. One day, its designers arranged for it to learn that its spare battery, its precious energy supply, was locked in a room with a time bomb set to go off soon. R1 located the room and the key to the door and formulated a plan to rescue its battery. There was a wagon in the room, and the battery was on the wreck, and R1 hypothesized that a certain action, which it labeled pull out, wagon, room, would result in the battery being removed from the room. Straight away it acted, and did succeed in getting the battery out of the room before the bomb went off. Unfortunately, however, the bomb was also on the wagon. R1 knew that the bomb was on the wagon in the room, but didn't realize that pulling the wagon would bring the bomb along with the battery. For R1 had missed that obvious implication of its planned act. Back to the drawing board. The solution is obvious, said the designers. Our next robot must be made to recognize not just the intended implications of its acts, but also implications about their side effects. By deducing those implications, it uses in formulating its plans. Well, you can imagine the second robot gets stuck deducing all these irrelevant implications, and the bomb blows up. And so it goes, and so it goes. I'm not going to quote more of this passage. Get to the point. This parable illustrates nicely the extent to which ordinary human commonsensical planning and action depend on pertinent background information available to the human agent that somehow gets appreciated and accommodated whether or not it becomes explicitly present in consciousness along the way. It also illustrates the extent to which planning and action typically are suffused with pertinent expectations about what will happen next if one acts a certain way, and about what would happen next if one were to act some other way. For example, what would happen if one were to pull the wagon out of the room without first removing the bomb from the wagon. Again, whether or not those expectations become explicitly present in consciousness. Okay. And these expectations, I think, are aptly considered aspects of theoretical rationality, whether or not you call them full-fledged beliefs. So that's the frame problem. That's the frame problem. How do you bring to bear in real time all the pertinent, relevant background information that you actually possess? Now, Dennett says this about the frame problem and our attempts at understanding it. The myth that each of us can observe our own mental activities has prolonged the illusion that major progress could be made on the theory of thinking by simply reflecting carefully on our own cases. For some time now, we've known better. We have conscious access to only the upper surface, as it were, of the multi-level system of information processing that occurs in us. Nevertheless, the myth still claims its victims. So the analogy with the stage magician is particularly apt. One is not likely to make much progress in figuring out how the tricks are done by simply sitting attentively and watching like a hawk. Too much is going on out of sight. Better to face the fact that one must either rummage around backstage in the wings, hoping to disrupt the performance in telling ways, or from one's armchair, think a prioristically about how the tricks must be done, given whatever is manifest in the constraints, about the constraints. The frame problem is then rather like the unsettling but familiar discovery, quote unquote, that so far as armchair thought can determine, a certain trick we've just observed is flat impossible. So that's the end of the quotation from Dennett. And he gives some other examples of this trick involving making a midnight snack, laying out how much profound but deeply ordinary commonsensical knowledge is required to do it without botching it. Okay, so in sum, his observations largely focused on the parable of the robot and also the midnight snack that I didn't go into, make vivid several crucial points that are going to be presupposed in what follows here. First, rational agents deploy and must deploy extensive amounts of pertinent background information in carrying out even quite mundane, ordinary activities. Second, such background information typically gets accommodated without becoming present in consciousness, a fact that has often led philosophers and psychologists too to seriously underappreciate the complexity and subtlety of common sense rationality. Third, practical rationality is much more suffused with elements of theoretical rationality than is often realized, namely expectations, which, like background information, typically are operative in ongoing practical agency without becoming present in consciousness. expectations are doxastic, surely, whether or not they count as beliefs. So I think they're susceptible to epistemic evaluation. Okay, so I'm on to section 2 now. Morals of the frame problem, part 1. Belief fixation as abductively inferential, and hence as non-modular. Here I'm agreeing deeply with Fodor. Belief fixation is the generation of beliefs and the maintenance of existing beliefs. And what's going to be said here applies to expectations as well. Rational belief fixation is the generation and maintenance of beliefs under circumstances in which those beliefs are evidentially well supported by one's available evidence and arise because they are thus evidentially supported. Hence, rational belief fixation is in an important sense inferential. It's a process whereby beliefs are generated on the basis of evidence that is possessed, and deployed by the cognitive system, evidence that supports the beliefs. And in general, rational belief fixation also is non-deductively inferential. This is important, since normally the pertinent kind of evidential support is abductive rather than demonstrative. So now I turn explicitly to Fodor. This being so, the frame problem arises in a stark way for belief fixation, a point that long was rightly and emphatically stressed by Jerry Fodor. Here are some pithy remarks that he made at the beginning of an essay of his own on the frame problem. Now I'm quoting Jerry. There are, it seems to me, two interesting ideas about modularity. The first is the idea that some of our cognitive faculties are modular. The second is the idea that some of our cognitive faculties are not. Everybody can envision Jerry saying something like that, right? By a modular cognitive faculty, I mean, for present purposes, one that is informationally encapsulated. By an informationally encapsulated cognitive faculty, I mean one that has access in the course of its computations to less than all of the information at the disposal of the organism whose cognitive faculty it is. So, for example, I think that the persistence of the Muller-Lyer illusion, in spite of one's knowledge that it is an illusion, strongly suggests that some of the cognitive mechanisms that mediate visual size perception must be informationally encapsulated. It's worth emphasizing, I'm still quoting, it's worth emphasizing a sense in which modular cognitive processing is ipso facto irrational. After all, by definition, modular processing means arriving at conclusions by attending to less than all of the evidence that's relevant and available. And ignoring relevant and available evidence is notoriously a technique of belief fixation that will get you into trouble in the long run. Informational encapsulation is economical. It buys speed and the reduction of computational load by, in effect, drastically delimiting the database that's brought to bear in problem solving. But the price of economy is warrant. The more encapsulated the cognitive mechanisms that mediate the fixation of your beliefs, the worse is your evidence for the beliefs that you have. And the worse your evidence for your beliefs, the less the likelihood that your beliefs are true. Rational processes have their debilities too. If, for example, you undertake to consider a non-arbitrary sample of the available and relevant evidence before you opt for a belief, you have the problem of when the evidence you have looked at is enough. You have, that is to say, Hamlet's problem, when to stop thinking. The frame problem is just Hamlet's problem viewed from an engineer's perspective. What is a non-arbitrary strategy for delimiting the evidence that should be searched in rational belief fixation? I don't know how to answer this question. If I did, I'd solve the frame problem, and I'd be rich and famous. Yeah, you can imagine Jerry saying that too. Okay, end of quotation. In other writings, including earlier writings, Fodor elaborated at length on these thoughts. He emphasized two aspects of the holism of non-deductive belief formation with an explicit analogy to the similar situation of non-deductive theory confirmation in science. He talked about what he called the isotropic feature, meaning that virtually anything you know is potentially relevant to what you should believe under the circumstances. He talked about what he called the Quinean feature, meaning that holistic aspects of the actual belief system and various potential successor belief systems are important when it comes to abductive evidential support. aspects like comparative theoretical simplicity, alternative ways of updating one's belief system. And way back when, I mean, if you remember the last chapter of the modularity of mind, for example, he wasn't claiming that the mind as a whole was modular. He was claiming to the contrary that much of it, including the central processes that are involved in things like belief, fixation, and planning, are not modular because they are holistic in a way that involves this Quinian and isotropic feature. Let me just give you a quotation from the later book, The Mind Doesn't Work That Way. Quoting Fodor again. Computational nativism is clearly the best theory of the cognitive mind that anyone has thought of so far. Vastly better than, for example, the associationist empiricism that is the main alternative. And there may indeed be aspects of cognition about which computational nativism has got the story more or less right. In the modularity of mind, these would have been perceptual aspects primarily. He was thinking of perceptual processing as plausibly modular, but not central processing. Back to the quote. But it's nonetheless quite plausible that computational nativism is in large part not true. And it wasn't the nativism that he was complaining about. It was the idea that this kind of cognition is computation. Okay. So now I'm on to part 3, Moles of the Frame Problem 2. Belief fixation as non-computational and as essentially morphological. The human cognitive system somehow accomplishes highly holistic, highly non-modular belief fixation and expectation fixation. If one supposes that the trick is accomplished by means of tractable representation level computation that somehow deploys what Fodor called a non-arbitrary strategy for delimiting the evidence that should be searched in rational belief fixation, then one will find it difficult to avoid concluding, as Dennett put it, that so far as armchair thought can determine a certain trick we have just observed, namely the holistically rational fixation of beliefs and expectations, is flat impossible. The way forward is to follow Dennett's two-pronged advice, either rummage around backstage in the wings, hoping to disrupt a performance in telling ways, or from one's armchair, think a prioristically about how the trick must be done given whatever is manifest about the constraints. This is something that I did with my colleague, with my late colleague, John Teesom, back in the 1990s, in particular in our 1996 book, Connectionism and the Philosophy of Psychology. A prioristically, we argued that highly holistic, highly non-modular cognitive processing must operate in such a way that much pertinent background information gets accommodated automatically without becoming a current, by virtue of the standing structure, that is the morphology of the cognitive system. We call information that gets implicitly accommodated in this way morphological content. And here I'm going to refer to information that's being accommodated in this way in the generating or maintaining of some current mental state or process as morphologically operative morphological content. So that's MOMC. That's how I'm abbreviating it. Okay, so that's the a prioristic part. Rummaging backstage in the wings, at a time when neural network models had come to prominence in cognitive science, we argued that abductively holistic cognitive processing should be understood not as the computational manipulation of explicit mental representations of all the evidentially pertinent information, but rather in terms of the kind of mathematics that goes naturally with neural network modeling, namely dynamical system theory. Morphological content is embodied in the topological contours of the n+1 dimensional activation space, or activation landscape, it's sometimes called, of an n-node neural network, with the activation of level of each node in the network being a dimension in the network's n-dimensional state space, and with downhill, so to speak, on the landscape, being the direction of time. Temporal trajectories along the activation landscape from one activation state to another, as determined largely by the morphological content embodied in the topological contours on the landscape in the vicinity of the initial activation state, constitute transitions from one current cognitive state to another. This is what connectionists would refer to as information that's in the weights of the network. So in this picture, it's embodied in the topological contours on the activation landscape in the vicinity of the current state, the current occurrence state, which is thought of as a point in activation space. The morphological content embodied in the local topological contours constitutes the morphologically operative morphological content, which can figure not only in the initiation of an occurrent mental state, but also in maintaining the persistence of this occurrent state over time. Let me stop for a minute and say something about what this is supposed to correspond to physically. A high-dimensional activation landscape, a dynamical system describing the cognitive system, doesn't describe the intrinsic structure of the device or the intrinsic structure of states of the device. It is a description of the full physical potentiality profile of the device. Its full set of potential ways that it would evolve from one initial state to another. That's physical potentiality profile is the physical thing which is described by this high-dimensional activation landscape. And it's quite important that a dynamical system like that has enormously rich structure to it. Structure which potentially could be harnessed in the design of an intelligent cognizer in such a way that the cognitive transitions needn't necessarily be ones that are tractably computable. So the picture was a way to think about how you could get beyond requiring that cognition be computation. Fodor, of course, hated connectionism. He thought that primarily what it was just a revival of associationism, and it could well be that virtually all actual connectionist models were ultimately just associative engines. So Kingston and I were not the kind of enthusiasts who thought, yes, now they're doing it, and real cognition is just more of that. On the other hand, what we thought we saw here was a conceptual framework which in principle could point the way forward, could answer the question, well, what could this kind of cognition be if it's not computation? Okay, section 4, morphological content and consciousness. 1, the Eoc assumption. So where we're going in this paper is to try to say something about if and whether and in what ways consciousness is relevant to the justification of beliefs. Rational belief fixation is abductively inferential. Rationally generated beliefs are ones that are well supported and typically non-demonstratively by evidence one possesses. I'm going to skip some of this. Prima facie, it seems plausible that content that gets implicitly and automatically accommodated during cognitive processing in the form of morphologically operative morphological content, rather than being represented by an occurrent mental state or process with that very content, can't be an aspect of conscious experience. That's what you might initially think. This is not to say that any occurrent mental state is conscious. It's rather to say that if an aspect of mentality is conscious, then it must be overt and occurrent. Okay? This we call the explicit occurrent content assumption, in short, the EOC assumption. Suppose you believe that. Okay, so you're thinking, all right, if there is this holistic, morphologically operative content that's morphological, it's not occurrent, then it can't be conscious. All right, but if it's really important to epistemic justification, then we're going to have to accommodate that fact in our story about the relationship between consciousness and justified beliefs. Now, how might that go? Section 5, doxastic justification 1, we talk about 3 alternative positions, each of which would embrace this explicit occurrent content assumption. The first one we call non-experiential reliabilism. The idea would be conscious experience isn't very important. What matters for the justificatory status of your belief is that it's reliably formed. And as long as there's morphologically operative morphological content, figures in the reliable formation of beliefs that really are, in fact, epistemically well supported by the holistic full body of relevant information that's in the cognitive system, well and good. Consciousness is pretty much shunted to the side. A second kind of position is what we call non-experiential evidentialism. You're not going to be a reliabilist. You're going to put primary emphasis on evidential support as the key thing for epistemic justification, but you're going to say experience doesn't matter very much because so much of the relevant evidential support comes from non-explicit, non-occurrent morphological content, which you're assuming is not conscious. The third kind of view would want to retain the importance of experience, but then it would shunt to the side all of that relevant evidence. So the third kind of view we would call evidentially blind, gut feeling experientialism. The idea would be, if it seems true to you, and if in fact the reason you have the belief is because all this unconscious all this unconscious accommodation of evidential support is in place, then your belief is justified. So you've got experience playing an important role, but experience is kind of blind to the evidence. It seems to us that none of these positions is really very theoretically satisfying or intuitively plausible. And what we want to do instead is to put in question the EOC assumption, which again is the explicit occurrent consciousness assumption. So the thought here is that a lot of this information, background information, that is evidentially relevant in belief fixation, and that it is typically operative without being explicit, operative in the form of morphologically operative morphological content, can and does make a difference to the character of conscious experience without that information being present explicitly in consciousness. And here's where the notion of chromatic illumination comes in. So now I'm in section 6 of the paper. The EOC assumption, recall, asserts that being represented by an occurrent mental state or process is a necessary condition for an item of content to be an aspect of consciousness. Admittedly, it seems quite plausible, but we want to suggest the following possibility instead. And I've got this on the handout. Perhaps sometimes there occurs a conscious process, phi, with these features. First, an occurrent conscious cognitive state, S, say an occurrent belief, for example, is a component of this overall state, phi, throughout phi's temporal duration. Second, S arises within phi and is sustained within phi in a way that deploys certain morphologically operative morphological content, M, that's relevant to it, evidentially relevant to it. And third, the overall phenomenal character of phi includes a specific phenomenal element, an aspect of the total something it's like to undergo phi, that constitutes implicitly appreciating both M itself, that is the non-occurrent evidential background information, and M's relevance to S. This is what I call chromatic illumination. That expression was inspired by thinking about a particular painting that I'm very fond of, that many of you will be familiar with, by Toulouse-Lautrec, called Et le Moulin Rouge. It hangs in the Chicago Art Institute. The thing that's so cool about it is that you've got all kinds of figures in the scene that are illuminated in very striking ways, but the sources of illumination are not in the scene. So that's some kind of a metaphorical stand-in for the character of conscious experience that somehow embodies appreciation of evidence that is not itself consciously present. How am I doing on time?
About 25 minutes.
Okay, good. So there's a kind of phenomenon that isn't that much discussed in philosophy of mind, at least. I don't know how much is discussed by psychologists, but I think it's really rich and especially helpful to kind of give you a feel for what I'm calling chromatic illumination. And that is the phenomenon of joke getting. I've been using the same damn joke for a long time. I know Louise has heard this before. I'm constantly looking for a better one. Please, if you have suggestions, let me know. Especially, I'm always checking cartoons on the New Yorker. I found some good ones, but I've never found one that I like this much, so I'm going to stick with it and just talk to you about a joke for a while. It's important culturally that this cartoon in the New Yorker actually appeared some 20 plus years ago. Did I? Right? My mic fade out. I think the battery just died.
I have no batteries.
Well, I think it's all right now. I'm not sure what happened. There are two guys in a bar. One of them is visibly very upset. You can tell by his facial expression and by his body, by his posture. And what he says to the other guy is, what I don't get is how she figured out that I'm having an affair with the babysitter.
Say that again.
What I don't get is how she figured out that I'm having an affair with the babysitter. Okay? It's important. This was 20 years ago now. So, back then, light talk was not as ubiquitous as it unfortunately is nowadays. Nowadays, undergraduates don't get this joke, I've noticed. Right? But, okay, so if you're going to get it, you get it pretty quickly and instantly. But the thing to do is to dwell on the phenomenology of that joke getting. Getting this joke, or any joke, is an instantaneous experience. In that instant, normally one needs to appreciate quite a wide range of pertinent background information. Also, one needs to appreciate why and how all this information combines holistically to constitute an instance of funniness. Fading in and out. Isotropic feature, maybe you could replace the battery for me. Isotropic feature and Quinean feature, right? I think joke getting really illustrates those things. Each item of information must be appreciated together with the ways that these items of information combine holistically to make for an instance of funniness. Otherwise, you wouldn't be understanding the joke. Thanks. And for any reasonably clever joke, it's possible to elaborate at some length upon the various items of background information. Okay. You can do that with probe questions, for instance. So take the example at hand. Probably the first thing you'd think of if you were going to explain this joke to somebody who doesn't get it is that back then, the practice of consistently inserting the word like into your sentence was a linguistic phenomenon primarily exhibited by teenage girls in the U.S. And probably it started in the San Fernando Valley north of Los Angeles because valley girls start fast, right? But that's just the beginning. I mean, that's just the beginning. Imagine somebody, there are lots of other probe questions that we can ask you, and you'll know the answer immediately, and you'll appreciate it. If you didn't know the answer in some sense already, if you didn't appreciate the answer in the instant of getting the joke, you wouldn't have gotten the joke. Who's the she who figured it out? How did she figure it out? How old is the teenager? How old is the babysitter? Why doesn't he understand how she figured it out? To elaborate answers to some of these questions would actually take some time, wouldn't it? But when you think about it, it seems that I must have appreciated all that or I wouldn't have gotten the joke. But it's not plausible phenomenologically that that was all overtly present in consciousness. So I think it's a plausible hypothesis that what's happening in joke understanding like this is that your conscious appreciation of the joke, your finding it funny, is chromatically illuminated by implicit appreciation of pertinent background information and how it combines holistically to constitute an instance of funniness. You experience these answers to the probe questions as it were emanating directly out of your recollected experience of having gotten the joke in the first place. The answers don't appear as it were out of nowhere, and the laughing at the initial hearing of the joke is not something like finding yourself laughing and wondering why. No, it's quite content specific, the joke getting experience. So I actually think that joke getting nicely illustrates the isotropic and Quinean aspects. And in fact, it's really relevant to belief fixation because these answers to probe questions already constitute beliefs about the joke, right? And credible, plausible, well-justified beliefs about the joke. Okay, so we go on at some length about some of the things that chromatically illuminated states do psychologically in terms of their role. A chromatically illuminated occurrent mental state is itself rife with dispositional potential in ways directly connected to the morphologically operative morphological content that's doing the chromatic illuminating. This dispositional potential includes the capacity to manifest in various ways one's implicit conscious appreciation of that content, with the chromatic illumination constituting the occurrent conscious categorical basis for the relevant dispositions. You know, it's your recollected experience of getting the joke, which is the phenomenal categorical basis of your capacity to accurately answer the probe questions. Importantly, let's see, what do I want to say here? Yeah, importantly, the emergence in consciousness of answers to probe questions like that is itself experienced phenomenologically as arising directly out of the recalled joke-getting experience, not experienced as arising out of the blue, and not experienced as hypotheses about why the joke was funny. No, you appreciated it right when you got the joke. Now, these introspectively ascertainable features of joke understanding phenomenology and probe question answering phenomenology are just what one would expect if indeed the original joke-getting experience includes the kind of rich chromatic illumination that constitutes implicit appreciation of all that information. I mean, somebody might think, well, okay, I'll grant you morphological content, but I'm not granting you this claim that it affects the character of conscious experience in a way that does not involve its overt presence. Somebody might balk there. But now, what I'm claiming is that the phenomenology I'm talking about is not the phenomenology that one would expect given an alternative hypothesis like that. An alternative hypothesis asserting that the morphological content in virtue of which the babysitter joke is funny, combined, contributed to your laughing without the simultaneous and supervenient presence in consciousness at the moment of mirthfulness of any implicit conscious appreciation of that morphological content. And, you know, the alternative hypothesis could also say that when I ask you the probe question, well, the answer just pops into your mind again, you know, as it were, out of nowhere. That's what you would expect on the view that says, okay, the morphological content is operative, but it doesn't have any effect on consciousness. What you would expect is that the experience of laughing would be laughing but not knowing why. The experience of answering the probe question would be coming up with an answer but not knowing why. Or perhaps coming up with an answer as a hypothesis about why it was funny. But that is not phenomenology. Okay, maybe enough about joke-getting phenomenology. Now we come to the question of the relation of consciousness to justified belief. On a picture which is positing that lots of morphologically operative content actually makes a difference consciously in the form of chromatic illumination. Section 7. Similar observations to what I've been saying here apply mutatis mutandis to the phenomenology of occurrent conscious beliefs. In fact, I think we already have an example of that with the answers to the probe questions, because those are beliefs about the joke and why it's funny. Normally, an occurrent belief that P is not experienced as evidentially untethered, as arising for no apparent reason out of the blue. That would be the analog of finding yourself laughing and wondering what's so funny, right? On the contrary, normally an occurrent belief that P is accompanied by an occurrent, evidence-sensitive epistemic seeming, a phenomenological aspect as of P's seeming true in virtue of specific evidence one possesses. Often this aspect will itself figure consciously only implicitly in the form of chromatic illumination. And although some pertinent items of evidence might be overtly present in consciousness alongside the P belief, Much of the isotropic Quinian evidential support for P that one possesses will be consciously appreciated only implicitly via chromatic illumination. Such chromatic illumination will endow the conscious belief state with various looming potentialities, often including the capacity to bring explicitly into consciousness in a piecemeal way certain specific components of the overall evidential support for P that is being appreciated implicitly and chromatically. Normally, though, even when certain evidentially pertinent items of information are overtly present and are being explicitly regarded as evidence for P, once consciously so regarding them will take place against a rich background of further evidentially pertinent information that itself remains only implicitly appreciated by a chromatic illumination. So typically, articulating what we call the justification for a belief will be similar to articulating the explanation of a joke. You know, I tell you just enough so that you now get it, but in order to get it, you're plugging in to a lot of further relevant background information that remains implicitly appreciated. If I mention the thing about light talk being primarily used by teenage girls, if that's enough for you to get it, then you're implicitly appreciating all the other stuff, and I don't have to tell you about it. So what this leads to is a view about the relation between consciousness and justification, which we find more phenomenologically plausible and more theoretically satisfying than any of the others that I mentioned, and we call it chromatic experiential evidentialism. So on this view, the character of your conscious experience when you're forming the belief that P is indeed very important justificationally with respect to P itself. But it's not evidentially blind. You have a seeming that P that, when things are going well, is actually chromatically illuminated by pertinent, relevant evidence that you possess. And you believe P because you've got a chromatically illuminated seeming that P. That's the picture. Chromatic experiential evidentialism. There's a section called chromatic experiential hierarchical pluralism, which I'm going to skip for lack of time. I'll just get to the conclusion now. The frame problem in cognitive science reveals that rational belief fixation typically is abductively inferential and non-modular, and hence that belief-fixing cognitive processes typically are essentially morphological. The holistic, abductively inferential evidential support that accrues to one's beliefs typically contributes to belief fixation in the form of morphologically operative morphological content. Although this does not itself get represented in belief fixation, nevertheless it does get implicitly appreciated consciously. This appreciation is constituted by the chromatic illumination phenomenology that is supervenient upon the morphologically operative morphological content. A novel kind of experiential evidentialism regarding doxastic justification thereby becomes available, chromatic experiential evidentialism. This view is considerably more plausible and attractive than are epistemological positions that would sever the connection between doxastic justification and conscious appreciation of the evidence one possesses in support of one's beliefs. Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll try right to left, just to try to be systematic. Yes?
So thanks. Super interesting. I'm wondering about how you think the contents are accessible. So when you get the joke, right, and you can explain, you can answer the probe questions afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. So I'm worried about whether your account can explain why you have access. You have explicit access to those answers. So it seems like if the information is just embedded in the architecture in the way that you suggest, there's no reason why we should be able to explicitly articulate the information that's embedded in the architecture.
I don't necessarily think that we're always going to be able to articulate all of it. In fact, some of it might remain deeply inarticulable. And in the case of joke getting, it can be pretty hard to say why something is funny. You know, you can start delimiting pertinent considerations, but then if somebody, all right, yeah, but why does that make for funniness? So it isn't necessarily all going to be easily articulable. But now, the idea is that if it's information that is embodied in the local contours on the activation landscape, in the vicinity of the activation state itself, which is the realization of your current mental state, well, okay, it's embodied in local contours, so it's available to affect conscious cognition from one occurrent state to another. So I ask you a probe question, and that same morphological content can now kick in along with, well, I've asked you a probe question, so you've jumped to a new activation state that sort of maybe retains some of the content of the old one. But the new activation state could also be at a point on the landscape where this morphological content, in terms of local topological contouring, is still present. Now, why and how the phenomenology supervenes on this architecture? I mean, I'm one of these hard problem guys, right? I believe in the hard problem of consciousness, so for me that's an aspect of the hard problem. But when I start thinking about architectural questions, think in terms of the topological structure of the landscape.
Yeah, I guess the concern is that this kind of architectural way of thinking about the content is going to get it so that you're likely to transition to get the joke. But it's not going to make it likely that you're going to be able to use that content for other purposes that are unrelated. In fact, that's a lot of the difficulty that we have with deep learning systems, is that they're highly specialized, that the content's not able to be used in other kinds of ways. So I guess I'm just concerned about the explanation for our ability to answer the probe question in virtue of encoding this kind of content.
I don't think I have more to say by hand. I'll have to leave it at that. Yeah.
So I want to ask you about the non-computational dynamical system stuff.
Yeah.
To some extent, I'm trying to channel Jerry, but I don't want to just start that argument.
Yeah.
So the way I want to put my question is something like, there's something appealing about, if we're just thinking about mental processes, it seems like the classical computational model is not going to work, and Jerry recognizes that. And something about dynamical systems seems like the right kind of architecture there. But then I'm trying to think, what other facets of the kind of Fodor worldview do we have to give up if we adopt that? So here's another sort of standard thing that Jerry used to say a lot. At least some of our processes of belief, fixation, are sensitive to logical structure, right? So how's that kind of thing? Or more generally, how's the compositional structure of thought going to fit into this lecture? Or is that something that we're just going to have to do?
Yeah. One thing I want to say there is that Keaton and I did not want to reject the language of thought. On the contrary, we have a chapter in our book called Why there still has to be a language of thought and what that means. So when it comes to occurrent states, we're thinking many of them should have language-like compositional structure, and we actually gave an argument of our own for that. Now, on the other hand, how do you think about compositionality and representations within this other framework? Well, it might have a lot to do with how occurrent representational states, actual ones and potential ones, are situated relative to each other on the activation landscape. And so, you know, and if you think about it that way, then even though you might well need that kind of compositional structure and structure-sensitive processing, it's not necessarily going to be a matter of computation anymore. When I thought about a non-computational approach to things, I said, well, okay, imagine a goddess, I named her Eva for evolution. She knows the kind of cognitive system she wants. So she already knows what sort of cognitive transitions she wants this system to be able to go through. And she knows what the physical resources are going to be that she builds the thing out of in terms of brain with however many neurons and connections and the rest of it. And so she's got a three-level picture that's kind of like Mars level 3 levels. At the top level, she's got cognitive transitions that she wants the system to be capable of going through. At the bottom level, she's got physical states and state transitions and the network. What does she put in the middle? A dynamical system so that she can realize these total cognitive states as total occurrent cognitive states as points on the activation landscape. But she's also got in mind all the background information that has to be accommodated. So the activation landscape has to be properly contoured. And there's another constraint, the dynamical system that realizes cognition that way has to itself describe the physical potentiality profile of the actual device. I didn't say anything about requiring that the cognitive transitions conform to attractively computable function over mental representation. And she doesn't impose that constraint on herself. So I'm thinking blind evolution can do that too. Yeah.
I've got a follow-up on the first question. So it seems, I can understand why you want to have one, and I can understand why you want to have two. But they look like their intention. So suppose your inferential process is you have P, then you feed in Q, then you infer Q. Okay, now, so suppose then the part if P then Q is encoded in a network, but it also encodes R and S, and if Q then P. Now, so what the network, what it seems as though you need in this second part of the network is it's got to be responding to the if P then Q in order to be rational. If it's responding to the R part, then it's not rational. And if it's just responding to a whole bunch of stuff, that also seems not rational. So it seems as though what you really need is not just what it could represent, but what it actually represents. So it seems like you actually need the content. So it looks as though, so that's my sense that you can't have both 1 and 2. Is that?
You're thinking about deductive logic now.
Yeah, I mean, just
a good cognizer should be reasonably good at least simple and obvious deductive inference. Yeah.
Or it could be inductive, right? I said that's like it could be let P be there's an exit sign, and the implicit belief is anytime there's an exit sign, there's probably an exit. And that's maybe abductive or something like that. But I don't think the example depends on it being deductive or inductive. The part I think it does depend on is that you can't just rely on what's implicit, what potential, what these weights potentially could represent. Because that's a lot of things that are going to be irrelevant, but you wouldn't want to be rationally, you couldn't rationally be, you couldn't be using an irrational inference.
Yeah.
You better have it be responding in some sense to if P then Q.
Okay, you said something about not relying on what the weights represent.
They could, you can't rely on just what they possibly can generate, but you need what they need actually to generate, say, P then Q.
One thing that seemed quite important to Teenson to me when we were looking at connectionist models was that it seemed that the ones that were more in the spirit of what we're talking about here would be ones where the representational content was highly non-local. So it's not like you could assign specific contents of specific activations of individual nodes. And it's not like you could assign specific contents to individual weights between connections. That's far too localistic. So we're actually, when we're talking about contours on this high-dimensional activation landscape, that doesn't in any simple way, translate into anything local in a network, right? And so I thought maybe the part of the spirit of your question was tied to a rather localist way of thinking about content.
Let it be, 18 real numbers, right? Just those 18 real numbers can be used to code if P then Q, if Q then P, R, S, T, any number of things, got millions of things. But it better be the if P then Q content that somehow figures in to give you a rational inputs. That's the word.
Well, Eva wants to get all that into the way she sculpts the landscape. When she's thinking about the cognitive transitions that she wants implemented, including deductive ones that respect deductive logic. And what she knows what those are. This is a convenient thought experimental trope. She already knows what she wants the cognitive transitions to be. And so what she's looking for is a dynamical system such that she can map the occurrent states to points on the landscape, and she can embody the relevant background information that is going to figure any particular cognitive transition. She can get that handled by the morphology near that point on the activation landscape. And then all of this has to actually be a dynamical system that describes the physical potentiality profile of a real brain. So she does that search in her divine mind, and evolution does the same. That's the picture. Yeah.
I'm going to ask something just because I'm confused, and maybe it's out of left field, but if it is, both of things are true, just say forget it, move on to something else. So I was trying to think of an analog, why we think, for example, in the domain of language, why we think that a computational system of the sort that's sort of standardly deductive makes sense. And so there's two components to it. One, and because, we assume that there's some sort of open-ended capacity. It stands in principle to an unbounded domain. And the reason we think that's a reasonable story is that we have a finite set of rules, computation, and importantly, a finite set of axioms, called those lexical entries. Okay. Once we have those two things together, we can talk about how it is that they together will generate an apparently unbounded set of things that we are cognitively capable with respect to. My thought with the frame problem, which I thought was Jerry's thought with the frame problem, was there's actually no way of specifying the finite lexicon. It's not the rules of deduction. So let's take a concrete example from the pragmatics literature, like one we're all familiar with, about how so-and-so, you should hire so-and-so because he has excellent handwriting. Right? We have no problem finding for that particular case the set of assumptions, called axioms, that together would lead us to conclude that that's a lousy method of reference. I can specify them, you can specify them. The problem is that we have no way of specifying, in some sense, a relevance function, which, given all the possible states of affairs that we worry about, here's the finite set of premises that, were we to have them, would, in that given case, give us the relevant deduction. So it's not the deduction that's a problem. It's not the inferences from line 1 to line 2 to line 3 to the QED that's the problem. That all looks like it's the same stuff we always do. The problem is that we never know how to specify it ahead of any particular instance of the event of interest what the set of premises are that we should use or that we do use. So it's the relevance function which is the problem. And I don't see, at least I didn't see, how talking in terms of connectionless landscapes gets us around that. In other words, how is the fact that the landscape picks out or identifies the relevant dimensions along which this thing is going to be useful, the thing will settle down. How is that solved by thinking of it in terms of that way? And it seems to me that's what you were suggesting, that there's something wrong with the deductive guts is the problem. But I never thought it was the deductive guts. I thought it was the source for the source for the premises. There's no analog to the finite lexicon.
I certainly do think that relevance is at the very heart of the frame problem. And you might or might not think of the relevant kind of computation that you're hoping to have as some sort of analog to deductive inference. You might or might not. But either way, yeah, the relevance problem is the heart of the frame problem. Now, I don't think that the story that I've sketched here fills in any details at all. And I see it as an answer to primarily as an answer to a how possibly question. How could it even possibly be the case that cognition does something that's better than computation? And here's an answer to a how possibly question. Whether we humans could actually even come close to understanding the details of such a thing, I don't know. But I think relevance is at the heart of it. Whether or not you think of the processing as somehow analogous to deductive reasoning.
So could you just sort of say a word or two more about how shift? So the only reason I used the deductive thing is because I took that to be the foil for the other way of thinking of things. So deductive or inductive, I don't really care, but some set of rules of inference given a finite set of assumptions that get you either probabilistically or deductively to some conclusion, right? And that the story you were telling is not that story, right? So could you just just explain to me again how the connectionist architecture that you're thinking about, were it the right architecture, would throw some light on how the relevance issue gets solved in a way that I guess I'll stop there. How the relevance issue gets eliminated?
Yeah, I don't know how much I can say in detail, but the general idea I've got is that high-dimensional dynamical systems, especially when they've got nonlinear aspects to them, have just enormously rich structure. And so this is a structure that is available to be exploited by cognitive engineering design. And in principle, the exploitation of that structure, where you've got current cognitive states realized by activation states on this landscape. You've got morphologically operative, morphological content embodied in local contouring in the vicinity of a given activation state that realizes a total occurrence state. And you've got cognitive transitions realized by trajectories downhill on this landscape. That's just really, really rich structure. There's not just n-dimensional distance, there's distances in all the subspaces. There are not just distance relations, but all kinds of structural features like where the attractors are, where the attractor basins are, the nature of the attractor basin boundaries, all the kind of stuff that complex systems people like to talk about. Really, really, really rich structure. Mathematically describable in dynamical systems terms, but then potentially realizable physically by the physical potentiality profile of a neural network, not by its intrinsic structure or the intrinsic structure of its states, but by its total counterfactual potentiality profile. So this is a really rich place for nature to look, and nature's got some resources to work with. And there's nothing in that picture that constrains nature to only embody cognitive transitions that conform to attractively computable function over mental states. That's very abstract, and I don't have details to fill in.
We have time for two more short questions.
Okay, please.
Okay, question short. So I was thinking very much along the lines that Barrett was talking about, and it made me think of Jerry's Module Strange Virgins Sleeping Dogs article, where he said, look, we could handle the apparent untractability of central cognition if we had a canonical notation where the where lexicalization is, for example, the compactness of the lexicalization is a guide to how natural the property is, or something like that. I think David Lewis has this idea, but Jerry argued, and I think this is correct, that there's no reason to think that that's correct, that that's right. But look, there's one place where it's really, I think, it's really, really hard to see how you could get a naturalistic, a non-intentional, non-representational characterization, reconstruction of relevance relation. And that's the fact that when you have representation, it's a feature of representation, that there's no guarantee that you're going to have a one-on-one relation from things in the world to representations. So Oedipus knew bunches of stuff about his mother, thought about in terms of his mother, that would have prevented him from marrying her, like the gods disapprove of this, or my kingdom will rebel if I do this. The problem is he had this other representation of his mother as Jocasta, and he couldn't integrate those two bodies of information. Now, if you've got that going on, I don't see how even nature can, even if Mother Nature is thinking the problem through, how she can guarantee that there isn't going to be this, as it were, unnatural separation of information. That is, you'll have what's subjectively information about two different things, that in fact is information that applies to the same thing, but you don't know it. And that's a feature of representational systems, not a bug. It's just something we have to cope with.
So, are you thinking that this feature that's not a bug is something that is hard to understand on the story I was telling?
It's hard to see how you can say, how you could specify in advance, it seems to me, a morphological relation that was going to be able to cope with the monkey wrenches that could be thrown into figuring out what's relevant to do, what's a good thing to do in a circumstance, or what's relevant to a certain problem. I got lost in a sentence. How you could get a morphological relation that would, in advance, take account of these problems that come from the intentionality of information.
Well, one quick thought I have about that is that, I do think that there are current representational states, and I mean, on this picture, they are embodied by points on the activation landscape. So, you could have a Jocasta point, and you could have a my mother point. It wouldn't necessarily be the same point. And the system might be so configured that it's not available to the system that those two representations co-refer.
Right, but any information you have about your mother, Oedipus's mother, is relevant to any decision he's making about that person.
Right.
So how can your morphology track the relevance relations, which would immediately make anything he knows about his mother relevant to anything?
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily do it perfectly. I mean, in some cases there will be relevant stuff that's not properly accommodated, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's not a bad feature of this picture, because in fact that happens in real cognition. I mean, I was talking about the ideal case where you're doing everything well, but of course there are plenty of ways of doing things badly that also I think a picture like this accommodates. I mean, Tisa and I, one thing we talked about was implicit prejudice and why it's so hard to get rid of. I mean, if it's actually embodied in the activation landscape and not just in the current representational states, then, even if you think you're not prejudiced, it might well be, and it might be not so easy to get rid of it, because, what we do to the system to change its morphology.
I'm going to have to ask Chris to stop there. The playing segue to dinner. It'll be time for further questions. Thank you, Terry.